Hello and welcome to a Heritage University class covering virtual meetings. If we have not met before, my name is Melissa Rogers and I am the Vice President of Business Development here at Heritage Property Management Services. Tonight I am joined by Jamie Lyons, Jay Lazega, and Rob Stein of Lazega Johanson Law. They will be talking about all things related to running successful virtual meetings. While we will be speaking about community association related topics, and they are attorneys themselves, we do encourage that each of you reach out to your current association's attorney for any specific questions related to your community. Each of you are free to submit your questions in the upper right-hand corner of the Q&A section. We will be having a Q&A question time after the presentation. However, you are more than welcome to submit your questions throughout the conversation. If this is your first time attending a Heritage University class, welcome. We are so glad you are here. Heritage University offers a number of classes throughout the year, and you can find our schedule by visiting heritageproperty.com and selecting homeowner resources. Each of you attending tonight's class will receive a copy of the full recording and any materials reviewed today. So everyone, pour a glass of something to drink and get and enjoy tonight's class. I now introduce you to Jay Lazega.
Thank you, Melissa and the Heritage team, for allowing us to do this program. Hello, everyone. I'm Jay Lazega of Lazega Johanson. We're really excited to do this program on conducting virtual meetings. We have experienced nearly 2 years of COVID now, and this platform or method of virtual meetings has become the norm. I'm sure you've seen it, you've been involved in it, but we've actually been both promoting it and conducting it for years. We have seen and known it to be the most effective and the most inclusive method of conducting business, of meeting, either as a board or as a community. So we're going to talk about that tonight with Jamie Lyons and Rob Stein, my partners and friends. Before we start, I want to invite you to visit the resources section of our website, ljlaw.com. We have a ton of information and sample documents on not only this topic, but dozens of others. Feel free to use them. Hopefully we are your lawyers, but even if we are not, feel free to use them. And if you have questions that we don't get to tonight, feel free to reach out to us. We're excited, and Rob is going to begin. So, Rob, have at it.
Thank you, Jay, and welcome everyone. We're glad to be here tonight to share some of our expertise with you. We probably the best place to start is with virtual meetings and virtual annual meetings is why we're having them. Obviously, because of the pandemic, kind of brought these to us, and they became legal last year with an executive order from Governor Kemp. There was some support for them even prior to that time, but Governor Kemp did an executive order, and then the legislature passed a law fully making virtual meetings an option for nonprofits, condominiums, homeowner, and condominiums and property owner associations. So what's important to keep in mind is that we need to have an annual meeting. The nonprofit code says we need to call an annual meeting every year. And the pandemic doesn't take that responsibility away from us. It's still there. COVID is not an exception to trying to avoid having an annual meeting. We have to have them, whether we are appointed by the developer, whether we are members of the board by having elected previously. As an association, we must call an annual meeting. And with this new law, it is even easier and more legal to do. So, as we kind of roll into this, what you have to keep in mind is the requirements for annual meetings both from Georgia law and from your own documents, still fully apply to annual meetings that are being held virtually. Requirements for notice, requirements for quorums, that threshold, all these requirements still apply. So we're going to kind of walk through some of those things as a reminder, refresher, as a teaching moment, so that you can make sure create your own checklist. Because, and as I say that, you know, it's a great idea for each of us, for each of our communities, to create a checklist of what it takes to get the annual meeting in place. And as we go through tonight, you can kind of start creating that so you have it for down the road. So,
Rob, can I interject for a second?
Please, Jamie, go ahead.
The concept of the checklist is a very good idea, and I get asked regularly, can you give me a checklist that we can use for our association? And the answer is I really can't. The checklist for each association is going to be different and based on your own legal documents. So for one association, the number of people that have to show up to a meeting to vote at a meeting is going to be different from another association. I shouldn't just make a checklist that says what number of people have to show up. It should be for your association. Here's how you figure out how many people in our community have to show up. So while we can give you basic topics of things to put on your checklist, the answers to what should actually really be the details of your checklist are found in your own documents most of the time. So I just want to say that we can't provide one for you just as a general tool because it would be too vague. It wouldn't even serve a purpose. But you guys should make them for yourselves or work with your lawyers and, of course, with Heritage to make the checklist for yourselves so that you can use it year after year.
So the first topic, at least I would say for that checklist, is notice, because we've got to be planning in advance, far enough advance, to get out notice for the annual meeting. And typically, at least under, we're going to talk about 3 different laws tonight: the Georgia Nonprofit Corporate Code, which applies to all associations, the Georgia Condominium Act, and the Georgia Property Owners Association Act. And for communities, as a condominium, been submitted to the Condominium Act, or if you're an HOA, you may have been submitted to the Property Owners Association Act. And that's something, if you're not sure, you can check off with your manager or your attorney. But the time frames, let's just start with that. For an annual meeting notice, if you're under the Georgia Condominium Act or the Georgia POA Act, you have to send out an annual meeting notice at least 21 days in advance of the annual meeting. But even prior to that time, you have to be thinking about the things you've got to do in advance of that, because you may, if you have a nomination process, then you're going to want to back up your timeline to create a communication to the community to seek nominations. So you've got to be thinking far enough in advance to kind of have these things roll into place. Whereas so that you've got everything you need. Now, one of the major things that we're going to recommend to you is that you not have the election at the annual meeting. And that's why the timeline in advance becomes important, because having an election at the annual meeting virtually is we've amongst the 3 of us, we've attended hundreds of virtual annual meetings. And those where the election takes place at the annual meeting becomes very problematic, because beyond, and we'll talk about the process a little bit further later, the check-in, trying to coordinate an election and voting, particularly the voting part, where you have to have people either raise their hand in the electronic chat or use a poll feature. It becomes very challenging for whoever's running the meeting in the background. And so we highly recommend that you do the election in advance of the annual meeting or after the annual meeting. You could have nominations at the annual meeting itself, and you could have the election afterwards. So can your community have a election outside the annual meeting? Most of you will be able to do that, but it depends on your bylaws, because Georgia law, the nonprofit code, says that any action that we can take at a meeting, we can take outside the meeting by a written ballot outside the meeting, as long as our bylaws don't say that we can't, or somehow further limit it in some way. And I can say for us, almost all of our communities don't have any prohibition on that, and they are pulling these elections outside their meeting, doing them in advance or doing them afterwards.
I want to jump in for just a sec. One of the things that I like to do when we teach this type of class is kind of compare what you typically have done in the past to what we're suggesting that you do with electronic meetings. And so Rob is talking about nominating board members, and in most of your communities, there is probably in your bylaws a provision regarding nominations by like a nominating committee before the annual meeting would take place, where a group of 3-4 people get together as the committee, decide how many, figure out how many spots are open for election, and then start calling people and asking people if they want to be nominated for those spots, so that the committee nominates people to run for the board. And also, most of you guys probably at your annual meetings used to take nominations from the floor. So you would ask out loud in the meeting when everyone's sitting there, hey, does anyone want to run for the board? And people would say, I would, or, I nominate Rob. When you're doing a virtual meeting, if you're going to have an election at that meeting, having the nominations has to come beforehand also. But most of the time you do that either by kind of requesting applications from owners, or still having a committee of people figuring out who should be nominated. So the nomination process of who should be running for the board is often very similar, whether you're having it an in-person meeting or an electronic meeting. The stuff that happens before the meeting is typically the same. You just have to kind of think through what it's going to look like and how it's going to be different when you actually physically get to the meeting, whether you're in person or virtual. Does that make sense?
Jamie, thanks for that. And that's exactly, thank you for expressing that in that detail to everyone, because I think it's particularly helpful. As you've got to create this timeline, kind of working backwards to take into account each of the steps that under your bylaws you've got to account for. The nomination process, into the election process, into the annual meeting, because what we want to do is avoid having to take any votes if we can at the annual meeting. Some communities, you may have to vote on a budget at the annual meeting. Many communities have in their declaration of covenants the ability for the board to put a budget in place and for it to be disapproved, to require that there be a vote to disapprove at the annual meeting. And let me say this, if yours has that, then if there is a motion through the chat feature, through the question feature, et cetera, depending on how you're running the meeting and which software you're using, you've got to allow that to happen, that motion to happen, to turn over the budget. So, but if we can, anything that we can pull out for voting, which is generally the election, and if we have to vote on the budget, let's do that outside the meeting, and it will make things run a bit smoother. The meeting itself will become very informational. I mean, the purpose of an annual meeting there's really two. One, to elect a board, and we can pull it out. And the other is to share the financials and et cetera with the community, so they know how the year has been and what the next year looks like. So then let's move to quorum. The quorum requirements to have a virtual annual meeting, again, are exactly the same as if we were all in a room together.
Rob, hang on 2 seconds. Before you move to quorum, I do want to touch on, or I'd like you to touch on, when you said, you have to send notice out to the owners, and you had said for, condo and POA, it's a 21-day notice period. That's the same thing whether you're virtual or whether you're in person. But for an HOA, what is the notice requirement for an annual meeting, whether it's virtual or in person?
Yeah, absolutely. It's it is a minimum of 10 days and a maximum of 60 under the nonprofit code, but you need to check your bylaws, because your bylaws can vary that. So you have to check your bylaws, and how those notices are sent. Again, for a homeowners association, check your bylaws. For a condo or POA, check your bylaws. But the Condominium Act and the POA Act both give condominiums and POAs the ability to send out notices via various ways, including email, as long as the owner has designated an email address to the association. So a lot of good opportunity under those laws if you're subject to them. Now, in any notice, the notice for an annual meeting needs to state the date, the time, and the location. And you might say, well, the location, it's being held virtually. Well, the location for a virtual annual meeting will be the link that is sent out in the meeting notice to say, here's how you connect to be able to attend the meeting. So
Interestingly, when you do that and you put the link into the meeting notice, if you're sending the meeting notice like by mail, because let's say your documents require that it be in the mail, then the link is not an active link because it's a piece of paper. So you also need to send that notice electronically to the extent that you can, so that people can actually click on the link instead of having to type in the numbers onto their Zoom or GoToMeeting or whatever platform you're using. So just be careful of that. If you're putting the link in as the location, you should think about how you want to communicate that information to the members, which might be twice. You might have to send it via mail to comply with your documents, but you might want to send it via email from a practical perspective, because that's what people are realistically going to use to put onto their calendar and then to actually just click on when they're ready for the meeting time.
and of course, since your heritage managed communities, they're going to be able to walk you through all these steps, but you'll now know more of what's going on in the background and know the options and opportunities that you have. Turning to quorum, the quorum again remains the same, whether we're in a room.
Define
Yeah.
quorum. Some of the board members might not even know what a quorum is or what that word means.
Thank you, Jamie. I appreciate
Sure.
that. Yeah, quorum is the minimum threshold number of eligible members who have to be in attendance, and that attendance can often be in person or by proxy, in order to be able to have an official meeting start. So effectively to call it to order, to have it official. And when I say it's official, we can only do business if we meet that minimum threshold requirement. For homeowner associations, again, and for condos and for property owner associations, everyone has to turn to their bylaws to find out what the requirement is. If your bylaws happen to have been silent, then the state laws provide default fallback numbers for that. For homeowner associations, if your bylaws were silent, it's 10% of the eligible owners. For condominium and POAs, the state laws provide that you have to have more than a third of the owners who are entitled to vote. It's an interesting little quirk for condos and POAs. You definitely want to, if you use proxies, those have to kind of dovetail with your association bylaws, because there was a court case some years ago that interpreting the Condominium and POA Act that essentially left things that for condos and POAs to be able to use proxies towards getting quorum, your bylaws need to say that owners can attend in person or by proxy. There has to be special language in there in order to take advantage of the ability to have proxies be used to get quorum. So again, management or your lawyers can help you further with that. Jamie?
I just want to mention a proxy, if you're not sure what that is, guys, is a document that is in writing, and it essentially gives someone else the power or authority to be you at the meeting if you can't attend. So it's a piece of paper that I would write, I can't be at the meeting, I give Rob my proxy. And that allows Rob to walk into the meeting as himself, representing his own property, and also as me, representing my property. And depending upon which type of community you're in, what has to be on this document is different. From condos and POAs have to have the proxies include certain language, and HOAs have a little bit of a difference in what must be in the proxy for it to be valid. But a proxy is essentially, I can't be there, so someone else can act as me.
And the great thing about them is as long as they have certain words on them of appointing someone to act for you, and it's signed, and as Jamie mentioned, if it's, for condos and POA, if it's dated, it could be it doesn't need to be an original. It could be a copy that you give to someone else to act for you. You could email it to them. It could be the email itself could be the proxy. It just needs to have the very basic requirements to it, but it doesn't have to be original ink on paper. And if for a lot of communities decide they don't want to send out proxies for whatever reason, strategic reasons or otherwise, there's no requirement under Georgia law that you provide a proxy form. A lot of communities do that in order to try to get quorum to take place.
There's also no requirement that an owner fill out a prescribed proxy in order for it to be valid, unless your bylaws require it. An owner can submit a proxy on a napkin as long as it's in writing. So it just depends on exactly what your documents say, but in most circumstances, the ability to use proxies is very broad and very flexible.
And of course, with what we're talking about tonight, virtual meetings, if we can accomplish our business of the meeting, the election or a budget vote if needed outside the meeting in a much easier format, then worrying about getting enough proxies to have quorum is a non-worry, because there will be no actual business we need to do at the annual meeting. And even if we don't have a quorum, we recommend that you still do all the informational things that you're going to do at the annual meeting anyway. I like to say, reward those who've come to the meeting, who've attended, be it in person or virtually, for having come with all the same reports. I hate seeing communities that, so once in a while we decide, well, we don't have a quorum, we're going to adjourn right away. Well, let's reward those folks who've come. Let's give them all the information they would have gotten anyway. So, and then shifting to the meeting itself and the check-in process, you're going to need to have somebody who's familiar with the software. And it may be that Heritage is running these meetings for you through their offices. If you're doing it yourself, in either way, having done some of them in the background myself, you need to be familiar with the software, go to meeting, go to webinar, Zoom, etc., and the features and the functionality, although they all have a lot of similarities, because you've got to check people in. As folks have their links, and depending on the software, we have to have a check-in process that takes place so that we can determine if we need it, quorum or not. And again, if there's no quorum, have the meeting anyway. Jamie?
So when Rob is talking about checking in, I kind of want to just give you a picture of what that looks like in my mind. At an in-person meeting, what we used to do is have, pieces of paper listing everybody's names and their address, and then a little spot where the person can sign in for themselves. So you want to do the exact same thing as far as check-in on an electronic meeting. So what I would do in advance, and what I have done with a number of Heritage managers, is prepare a piece of paper, a document, a list of all of your owners, all the addresses, and then identifying who is delinquent or a violation or otherwise ineligible to vote. And whoever is the person in the background, quote, checking people in, has that list. And what you end up doing is, as people get on to the Zoom or get on to whatever platform it is, electronic platform, you ask them to please put their name and their address into the chat. And it's really important that we do this because if my husband's name is Johnny, so if Johnny and I are both wanting to be at the meeting at the same time and he gets on his computer and I get on my computer, y'all might think, oh, we can count that as two people because you see participant number and that's 55 or 53. And you're counting me and my husband as each an individual participant, when really we represent the same property and can only, quote, check in for one property, the one property that we both own together. So you want to be able to identify each person and what their address is. And so if I'm the one behind the scenes checking everybody in, I'm looking at the chat and Rob signs in and he puts his address and I look at my form and I check it off. And then Jay signs in and then, Melissa signs in and Josh signs in, I sign in, whoever's coming. And I watch the chat and I check off everybody as they're identifying themselves. And I check off only one person per lot. And that way I can kind of go through my list as people are signing in and then count and see if we have a quorum. So I can actually do the same type of thing as I would normally do if we were in person at a meeting. But you just have to prepare these things in advance so that you're ready to go when this is happening. It is very, very difficult to watch the chat and not have a separate list that you could check off on, because then you're constantly trying to write people's names down and constantly trying to figure out if their address is the same as someone else you already wrote down. And it's a much more cumbersome process. So check-in should look very, very similar electronically as it does in person, but instead of the person coming up to like a desk and signing, they're instead just putting their name and their address in the chat. And it is very important that they put their address in the chat, because that is the easiest way to identify the properties on the list is to put them in address order, and then you can very simply check people off instead of trying to find names alphabetically or figure out if there's a co-owner or if someone's a proxy. So I would just strongly suggest that you kind of prepare that stuff in advance.
With this, a reminder of the great thing about virtual meetings is how inclusive it is for the ability to have everyone attend.
Yep.
Maybe I'm stuck at work and I wouldn't be able to go to the meeting. Maybe I'm taking care of the kids that night and I wouldn't be able to go to the meeting. Maybe I'm
you're
on
out of town.
vacation. Exactly. And I wouldn't be able to go to the meeting. The great thing, everyone, it is enfranchising everyone. It gives everyone the ability. And by pulling the voting pieces out of the meeting, it's giving everybody time to think and consider on candidates. So virtual meetings give so many great things. Who knew that we were going to get good things from the pandemic?
I'll tell you that in my experience so far, and we've, as Rob said, have done hundreds of these, there are so many more meetings where more people are in attendance than I've ever seen before. We're getting quorum way more often on electronic meetings than we ever did in in-person meetings, because it's not a schlep to get to the actual event, the meeting itself. It's very, very simple, and people can even get on the, do it on their phone if they need to, and so it's a much easier process. Conduct at the meeting, once we've checked everybody in and get going, is very important. And I say very important because, as you guys already know, probably from a million trillion electronic meetings that you've had over the last couple of years, if you're not having everyone muted, then everyone can hear stuff in the background. It becomes much more difficult to kind of follow along with the program. And I mean, you can even hear people typing if they haven't muted themselves. So it's extremely important that the platform that you're using has the ability for the organizer or the presenter to be able to mute everyone with sort of one button and keep everybody muted during the informational part of the meeting, so that it's an orderly type of experience. I will also say that,
and Jamie, to that point, we just kind of emphasizing it. When we're in the room and we have that obnoxious person who's in the back who wants to interrupt constantly.
Wait, I want to ask another question, Rob. Hang on, Rob. I have another question, Rob.
I object. Exactly. Everyone can get an opportunity to connect and to talk. I say talk, through a chat feature, but it enables everyone to have a better experience with the meeting.
I think what Rob means is you don't have to unmute the person that you don't want to unmute.
Right.
Just leave it at that.
Exactly.
So the piece, the main function of the meeting turns into a very different experience when you're doing an electronic meeting and you're also doing your voting outside of the meeting. Normally, as Rob said before, we're using our annual meeting typically for an election of directors. It's rare that you actually have to vote on the budget, but it's very common to actually have an election at your meeting. It is extremely cumbersome to vote on actions at a meeting that is done electronically. And the reason that I say this is because if you think of using the chat to check everybody in, then when we have to vote on something, if we're voting on directors, if we're voting on an election at the actual meeting, and we have, let's say, 4 people who are running for 3 slots, that would be a miracle. I know, more people running for less slots. But let's just say, by some miracle, we have 4 people running for 3 spots. You end up having to have an election or a vote for each spot separately. So you can't vote. It's very hard to have each person in their chat write the 3 names that they want to elect. And part of the problem is most people don't want other people to know how they're voting. So if you're in the chat and you're replying to everyone and identifying your 3 people, it makes people very uncomfortable. So they'll oftentimes just email or just chat to one person privately with their information of who they want to vote for. But then you're constantly having to go back up at the top of the chat, write down what each person's vote is for each of the 3 people. It's very, very difficult. You could also have a vote per slot. So for the first slot, everybody put into the chat to that so-and-so person, to Jamie privately, the one person you want to vote for that one slot. For the second slot, you then do another vote. For a third slot, so you're literally going through these votes. Each slot has its own vote. It becomes very difficult. If you're removing all that stuff from your meeting and just essentially having a conversation about the finances of the association, the meeting is way more streamlined. But when you remove those things from the meeting and you have to do an election outside of the meeting, it becomes a whole different ball game. And we need to make sure that your documents are permissive. And we also need to make sure that if your documents are silent, that we follow the requirements of the law as far as what that election looks like. So I said already before, in person at a meeting, nominations from the floor, and then you kind of count the votes. You send out give out a voting form. Everyone signs for their 3 directors. They circle the 3 out of the 4, and someone then says out loud, okay, who can help me count the ballots? Someone who's not related to anybody who's running. You go out of the room with all these voting forms, and then you start tallying who won the election, and then you announce it at the meeting. That's what we used to do. That's a traditional type of election at an in-person annual meeting. So if we're doing a virtual meeting, then we have to evaluate how do we want to deal with the nomination process and what should that look like. And if we're not going to do, there's 2 ways to handle it. We could do the whole election before the meeting even starts, so that at the annual meeting that we're doing virtually, we can announce who won. That's one way to do it. Or we can kind of do the reverse, talk about the election at the annual meeting that's virtual and explain to everybody how it's going to work and what we're going to do, and we're going to do it after the meeting. And then we announce the results whenever the results, whenever the balloting process is finished. So those are your 2 options. Finish the whole vote and election before the meeting starts, or don't even do it until after the meeting is over. And there's really not that much of a preference one way or the other, but you just have different timelines, essentially, whichever one you choose. So what we see associations doing when the election is going to be before the meeting is, number one, you've got to send out a notice to everyone, kind of explaining that to them what the process looks like. Here's the timeline of events. This is what you should expect. And we start that timeline of events usually with a request for nominations. And what we're seeing most associations do, not all of them, but most are doing this, they're sending out a candidate application form where essentially people who want to nominate themselves will fill out an application. It identifies themselves, it identifies their address. Sometimes we have on there how long have you lived here. Oftentimes it'll say whether or not you're a resident owner or whether you live off-site or off the property. Sometimes there are personal questions about your family or what experience you've had before serving on a board. Sometimes it gets even deeper into questions about what you think is best for our community. And sometimes I've seen them actually ask 1 or 2 very specific questions about, are you in favor of speed bumps? If there's some kind of major issue on the agenda in the community. So oftentimes the association will start out their timeline with this candidate application, and there's a deadline for the candidate application. And the candidates, if they want to, will fill out this application and send it back into Heritage. And then Heritage compiles that information, and hopefully we have a bunch, more than we need, more than the number of slots. And the idea is that these candidate applications will be transcribed into a format that can be sent out to the membership, identifying sort of a paragraph format of each of the candidates, or the actual application itself, depending upon what type of information is on there. The second part of this, after we've got our nomination, our candidate applications in, is a decision that the board has to make. I have some associations who are interested in having a candidate forum where prior to the virtual meeting and prior to the whole vote, the association puts together another virtual meeting, but is a candidate forum where owners can jump onto, any type of electronic platform and essentially meet their candidates. Each candidate has an opportunity to speak, answer some questions. So it's as if you are nominating people from the floor of the meeting, And at the meeting, when everyone's there in person, each candidate stands up in front and gets to tell everybody a little bit about themselves. So it's the same thing, but it's in an electronic forum. You don't have to do that. The associations that I work with, some of them choose to, some of them say, nah, we don't need to do that. Everyone knows each other. Either way, if you're going to do a candidate forum, just think in your mind, according to the timeline, you've got to leave space for that candidate forum. So the idea is applications go out, application deadline happens, information about the candidate forum goes out, candidate forum happens. And then if we're having our election prior to the meeting, we have to send out ballots. Now, the way this works is under Georgia law, the associations are allowed to, or every nonprofit is allowed to take action outside of a meeting. Unless your documents limit or prohibit it, you can take action outside of a meeting by ballot or by written consent. Elections really need to be done by ballot because you have more than one person and you're going to vote in favor or against, that kind of stuff. So we do these by ballots. And the ballot has to have very specific language on it. There is a code section of Georgia law that requires that on the actual ballot, on the piece of paper that you're sending out or on the electronic notice that you're sending out as the ballot, the information has to include the name of the corporation. It has to include the number of ballots that need to be returned. We don't care how people vote. We just have to get return number of ballots, and the return number of ballots has to be the same number as what you would need for a quorum if you were having your meeting and voting on this at the meeting. So the number of ballots that has to come back to us, signed by the owner, is the same number as the quorum requirement. And you have to identify on the actual ballot what that number is. We must receive at least 50 ballots back, or at least 10% of the eligible owners have to return their ballot. Whatever the equation is for your quorum requirement for your association, we have to identify that. There has to be a spot on the ballot to vote for or against the item that's being voted on. And the ballot has to have a deadline. So there must be a deadline written on the ballot when it must be returned. And if these things are not on the ballot, then it doesn't qualify as an actual ballot, which would then compromise the election itself or whatever the vote is. So the ballots are usually prepared by Heritage. If we're the attorney, we'll usually look at it just to make sure it meets all the requirements. And on the ballot, it also identifies all the different people who are running for election. And also, there's usually some write-in spots just in case, like you would get nominations from the floor of the meeting. Kind of having a write-in spot allows people to nominate and essentially vote for additional people. And then usually with that ballot are sort of the candidate bios that you got through that candidate application process. The ballots go out to the owners, and we'll talk about how they go out in just a sec. The ballots go out to the owners. The owners fill out their ballots. They return them by the deadline. They get counted. They get you tally who wins the board seats, and then you are ready at your annual meeting to announce who won the election and who will be the new board of directors. Ballots and this whole process, in most circumstances for most communities, can go out in a number of different ways, can be handled in a number of different ways. And typically what I've seen is one of two things. First, I have seen some associations still want to do written ballots where they are sending out in the mail a written document that describes all the things I've just mentioned, or sometimes they're sending it out via email if their documents allow that type of delivery. Ballot return can be in any number of ways. In almost all circumstances, someone could take a picture of their ballot and email it. They could scan it, they could send it, they could drop it off somewhere. There's like a million different options for returning a ballot. The other way I've seen elections be handled is through an electronic voting process. And what that looks like is there are different types of apps and different types of platforms that run electronic elections. And the ballot is identified in advance. You put all of your wording together, and someone gets a kind of like personal code to go onto this particular app to vote in this particular election. And they have to put in their password and their particular number so we can verify that the person's only voting once, that that home, that property is only voting once. They go on to this software program or software platform. They enter their specialized number. The ballot pops up, identifying all the things that we just said, and then it asks them to click on, whoever they want to vote for. They submit their ballot, and the software program automatically calculates who wins the vote, and it also keeps track of which property is assigned, which code number, and prints reports of the whole thing. And you get then a printed report identifying who won the election. And again, you can announce it at your annual meeting if you choose to. So that is essentially the voting for elections prior to the meeting. So the last thing I want to do is just talk briefly about what happens if you want to have your election outside of your meeting after your annual meeting. And what I'm seeing nowadays is a lot of associations that prefer to do it this way. What we're still seeing is the associations are sending out the candidate application forms, and they're still getting those candidate applications prior to the annual meeting. Sometimes they hold a candidate forum before the meeting, but very, very rarely. Normally, what's happening is at the virtual annual meeting, they announce the following people have submitted their applications for candidacy. Each one of them will have an opportunity to talk to you right now. So they unmute each of the candidates, and that is your candidate forum, just like you have it at an actual annual meeting in person. And each candidate gets 2 minutes to introduce themselves and take questions. Some associations have additional nominations from the quote floor, where at the virtual meeting, additional people can nominate people if they choose to, and they will also get an opportunity to introduce themselves and share information. And then you close that part of your annual meeting and move on to the finances or whatever else you're going to talk about, but you don't have the election at the meeting. You still do the balloting process outside of the meeting, after the meeting is over, either electronically or in writing, whatever way you guys want. But everyone has then had an opportunity who's at the meeting to sort of have the candidate forum and the whole nomination type thing from the floor of the meeting, similar to what they used to see in an in-person meeting. And then you do the balloting afterwards. And then after you've done that deadline, after you've passed your deadline for the ballot, you've announced your results to your membership in some way. Some send it out in an email, some post it on the front entrance, some put it in the elevators, whatever you want. Like you tell people, hey, this is who got elected to the board. And so I don't think it matters which way you do your elections, before or after your virtual meeting. But I do think it is well advised to not do the election at the actual virtual meeting. I'm trying to think of what else we wanted to mention. I'm looking at my list and I don't see anything that we kind of missed.
We were going to mention meeting agendas, that keeping the flow of a meeting going is, we've seen it go really, I've seen this with many times I've been at heritage meetings. The manager will have an agenda for the meeting, so a timed agenda saying, here are all the topics I'm going to cover and the amount of time that's kind of allocated for each, so that it keeps the meeting moving forward. If it kind of gets stuck on an area, particularly depending on if folks are live or not, but it keeps the meeting moving forward. Everybody knows what's coming up and what's up next. So,
and the last thing that I want to mention is minutes of the meeting. When you have an in-person meeting, the secretary of the association is typically keeping minutes of the meeting. And there's this concept that if we don't get a quorum, if enough people don't show up and we don't actually have the meeting and call the meeting to order and have a vote on anything, then we don't need to keep minutes of the meeting. And I would strongly encourage associations to keep minutes of meetings, even if we don't get a quorum. So they're not really official minutes of a meeting that didn't happen, that didn't kind of, convene, but the quorum is really the requirement to, in order to take a vote at a meeting. So just having the meeting, calling the meeting, sending out notices of the meeting and showing up for the meeting, even if you don't have enough people to show up to conduct business, is important enough to keep minutes of, because really you want to be able to prove, no, we did have a meeting. We just didn't get enough people to come to actually do anything at the meeting. So you're required under state law to have one meeting a year, to have an annual meeting. Annual means once a year. So you're required to have one membership meeting a year. And when you call that meeting and you convene as a group, whether it be virtual or in person, you want to still keep minutes of the meeting. And the minutes for the meeting, whether you have a quorum or not, might be, hi, we're here, meetings, meeting called for this day, this time, number of our quorum, we did not make quorum or we did make quorum, but you have then some record for the association's books and records that identifies the fact that we actually called the meeting by sending a notice. We showed up, but we didn't have enough people there to call the meeting to order and conduct business. I would still strongly suggest that you keep those minutes, that you write up the minutes, even if you're not going to get a quorum, because you want that in the association's books and records. And I think we're just at our time now to start looking at questions. So if you guys have
Jamie, the first question that I see in the chat is, says, so the link for an online meeting, the question is, does it need to be sent in the first notice?
So it's interesting that you asked that. And in my opinion, it doesn't need to be sent in the first letter that you send out to your membership or your first communication that you send out to your membership about the process and what the expectation should be. But when you are sending out your official meeting notice, this is the corporate notice of date, time, and location of our annual meeting. That's where that link has to be included. If you have already set up the meeting virtually and you know what that link is, you can certainly put it in your initial communication. But that first communication is usually an introduction of the process and sort of a cover letter to send out the candidate applications. And that is not necessarily the time that you're going to send out your official meeting notice. So I don't think it has to be in there, but it can be if you have it available to you already.
Jamie, let me give you the second question that's come up.
Sure.
Can an association require homeowners to sign up and register for the virtual annual meeting?
It's a great question. In our office, when we are oftentimes hosting the annual meetings for our clients, and when we do that, we host it on a platform called GoToWebinar, and that's just the platform that our office uses in particular. And the platform allows the association to have people register. And in fact, you don't get the actual link for the meeting until you register. The link that you get in your annual meeting notice is the link to register. And when the person registers, they put in their name. We can actually put in whatever we can create the template of registration to be whatever the association wants. So typically it's name, their address, their email address, their cell phone number. So in the registration process, sometimes we gather information that you guys have never had. That is very helpful to add to your sort of membership roster. I don't think we can ask, where do you bank? And I don't think we can ask, where do you work, just in case we have to sue you and need collection information later. But you can ask a whole host of information in the registration process. And then once they register, they get the actual, there's an automatic email that sends out the link for the annual meeting, for the actual meeting itself. So I do think that you can create that process. And in most circumstances, the board of directors has a lot of flexibility and a lot of authority and a lot of discretion to make, to establish what that process looks like. So I would say generally yes to that. Rob, the next question is about documents. What documents must an association provide at an annual meeting? Financials, minutes of a prior meeting? What documentation must be given to the owners at an annual meeting?
Well, in part, that, of course, is going to depend on your association bylaws. The state law looks for, I think it uses the words comprehensive reports of the financial affairs of the community. And so you really want to look to your bylaws to see what specifics may be required. Many are pretty generic as far as those requirements, but check your bylaws as far as the financials that need to be given out. Often the budget is certainly going to be on that list. But again, you have to check your declaration and your bylaws to see what it calls for. As far as minutes from a prior meeting, it's a typical rule of parliamentary procedure that minutes will be provided either at that meeting or subsequent to the last annual meeting, be sent out so that they may be approved at that meeting. So if they haven't been provided at some point between last annual meeting and that one, they could be sent out with the annual meeting package and should be sent out with the annual meeting package for this annual meeting. Jamie, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't. I most of the time the documentation that is presented to the membership is often included with the annual meeting notice when they send it out in advance, so that you're not having to reproduce it for the owners at the meeting. With a virtual meeting, though, it's so easy now to attach documents to to the chat or to some button on the platform so that owners can download the information while you're at the actual meeting at the virtual meeting. So it becomes really easy. There are some questions also now about ballots and about quorum and sort of the process and procedure of the meeting itself. So the next question for you, Rob, is what happens in the annual meeting if we don't get a quorum? Do you need to start over again? What if we can't get quorum ever? And same question for voting for a board member. How do you handle the voting for board members if you can't get a quorum? And I would argue, I would suggest that you talk about one, if you can't get a quorum at the meeting, or two, if you are doing the election outside of the meeting and you don't get enough ballots back to constitute a quorum, so the vote doesn't count. What should they do?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And really it's, if we're doing the vote outside the meeting or if we're doing it at the meeting, as we've talked about, you've got to have a quorum either way. And so if we don't have a quorum, the answer is then we can't conduct an election. And if we can't conduct an election, we'll turn to our bylaws. But in most cases, the bylaws and certainly state law says that those who were in office continue in office until their successors are validly elected. Now, I think probably the core of this question is, do we have to do another annual meeting?
Yeah.
And the answer to that is not really. The state law says that you need to hold an annual meeting each year, and you may or may not obtain a quorum for that. And there's a comment to the code, and the comment's unofficial, but there's a comment in the code section that says it's frequently the case for nonprofits that while they may call an annual meeting, they may not be able to hold one because they don't get a quorum. And even though that's the case, the members of the board, as I said, stay in office until their successors are duly elected, and those decisions of the board members going forward are also valid as well. It's really important always to check your bylaws on these issues, but we have, in pre-pandemic times, we have said you don't need to call another annual meeting to our clients, unless their bylaws had something odd in them. Here in pandemic times, it's the same thing, but you might decide to do an election through an election post the annual meeting if you wanted to. It's kind of a decision the board should make with the manager and with the attorney.
I want to piggyback on what you just said regarding the directors stay in place until their successors are elected. And essentially what that means is in the event that we can't get a quorum at the annual meeting or we don't get the quorum back with the number of proxies we receive, the number of ballots that we receive, the board members who are in office at that time stay in their roles. What normally happens at that point, though, if an officer or director wants to roll off the board of directors or not be an officer anymore, is they resign. And typically, according to Georgia law, unless your documents specify otherwise, the remaining directors can fill that vacancy by appointing someone to fill that spot, or the other board members elect someone among themselves to fill that spot. So it is very possible that you can still have a process whereby the director who doesn't want to serve anymore stays on after the non-quorum meeting or non-quorum election and then resigns, and the remaining directors fill that spot, and the directors elect someone else in the neighborhood to fill that spot. Then the second director who's supposed to roll off the board that year resigns, and the remaining directors fill that spot. So you can have a series of resignations and then elections just from the board members to fill those vacancies. There's a distinction sometimes between how long the people who are elected to fill a vacancy can serve. Do they serve until the next annual meeting? Do they serve the remainder of the whole next term? And that is very dependent on your documents and very specific language in your documents. So but there is a way to get off the board and then get new people on the board as well in the event we need to. The next question is about, wouldn't the ballot count as the quorum count and not the attendance at the actual virtual meeting? I'm not sure I understand the question completely. Wouldn't the ballot count as the quorum? And I think you're kind of saying, wouldn't the ballot count as the proxy, essentially? If you couldn't be at a meeting, does the ballot count as sort of to create a quorum? And the idea is no. The meeting itself has to have its own quorum. And the idea that you're having an election outside of the meeting, it's called action outside of a meeting. And what's required by state law is that you have the same number of people responding and addressing that action outside of a meeting as you would need at the meeting. But they don't overlap and combine with each other. The quorum requirement that you need for your ballot might be the same. It is the same quorum requirement you need for your meeting. But when you're coming to the virtual meeting to do any action at the virtual meeting, which frankly, if you're doing your elections outside of the meeting, you don't have any action to take at the meeting. So you don't really care if you have a quorum. But if you're going to vote on an amendment at the virtual meeting, you have to have a quorum for that. And that is completely separate and apart and distinct from the action that you're taking to vote on your directors. They're might be the same number, but they're totally two separate things happening, maybe simultaneously, or maybe kind of parallel with each other. But the ballot that you use for your election does not count as being present at the meeting when the meeting actually takes place, whether it's in person or virtual. I hope that makes sense. Did that make sense, Rob?
It did. You
Okay.
essentially you can't mix the ballots outside the meeting with
Right.
proxies in the meeting. So
Or with being present at the meeting.
yes. Question 6, let me read it aloud. It says have a quorum, but not if you have a quorum, but not enough pre-volunteers to match open positions. I guess that's the assumption.
Mm-hmm.
You have a quorum, but you don't have enough candidates coming forward for the number of seats that are open. The questioner is saying, ask for volunteers and enough to come forward at the virtual meeting to match the number of open positions. Do we still have to vote, or can we say the board approved by acclamation? So it's the acclamation question, Jamie.
Yeah, so just because you have the same number of people who are running for the exact number of spots that you have, you should still have a motion to what I call elect the slate, or elect that number of those people by acclamation. And really what you do is you say, I make a motion that we elect the slate of nominees to the board of directors. Someone seconds the motion, and essentially the motion passes by acclamation unless someone objects to it, is really how the process works. I do think it's important to still go through that process, and not just say, yep, they're on the board because we have the same number of people who are running as the slots that we have open. Again, if you don't have a quorum, you can't have that motion. You can't do any of that. So if there's no quorum at the meeting, in person or virtual, the acclamation concept doesn't work anyway. You have to still have that series of resignations, and then people get elected by the remaining board members to fill those vacancies. So you do have to still have a quorum to have that process work properly by acclamation. Rob, the next one is, what happens if you can't find enough candidates for the board? What happens if you can't ever get a quorum for meetings or elections?
Oh, we see that all too often.
Not so much anymore now with virtual meetings, though.
Well, that is really, it has definitely picked things up.
Yeah.
So if you can't find enough candidates for the board, then those folks who were on the board stay on the board until they resign. But we would, it's their responsibility. We believe it's their duty. Let's put it differently. If you're going to get off the board, that you need to find someone to substitute for you to appoint for your position, to have the rest of the board appoint to you, so you don't leave the board with no one sitting on the board. Not a good situation. What happens if you can't ever get the quorum for meetings or elections? Circling back, it is just that the board that was in office last validly elected, or through as people resign an appointment, Those folks continue to stay on the board until their successors are elected. You're on until you resign to get off. That's how it is. That's how it is under Georgia law.
Yeah. I do want to say that we have had so much progress getting a quorum together for a virtual meeting, but even more so when we're voting for elections by ballot outside of the meeting. It's not a big deal to get onto a website, check off a box, and submit your vote, or to even fill it out in person and drop it off in someone's house, or send it via email, take a picture of it and scan it, something like that. It is way easier to get the right number of people, or at least the minimum number of people together to to take that type of action. We've just had a lot more success. The very last question is, are new board members elected for the new calendar year, or do they take office immediately after the meeting where they were announced as directors? What do you think, Rob?
Thank you, Jamie. And let me say, we've had a lot of great questions. I appreciate all these. So the answer to this one is totally dependent upon your bylaws. If in most cases, I see bylaws that are silent on this, which means that as soon as the election's completed, the new folks are elected and come into office. Some, though, like in my own community where I'm on the board and I'll be off in about 2 weeks, we have term limits, so I have to be off. But ours, when the election takes place, our bylaws specifically state that the new board begins their term in office at the January 1. So you have to look to your bylaws to see what they say.
And if they're silent, as Rob said, you would start the new directorships right after that election. That's all we've got for you tonight. I think Melissa's back on to close out. But thanks for your questions.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Jamie, and to Rob. On behalf of Heritage University and Heritage Property Management Services, we thank our partners at Lazega and Johanson, and for each of you joining us. We look forward to seeing you again next time.